Decided to do like a world tour where we try to take a look at what's happening across the world on the scene of social media and the impact of this globally. So my name is Anders Mogensen. I'm the co-founder of Seismonaut, and I'm happy to be your host for the next couple of hours. We've invited 4 thought leaders from around the world to give their perspective on today's talk. First of all, we'll meet Ashok Krish, the head of innovation at SATA Consultancy Services, who will give a perspective on today's topic seen from an Indian perspective. After Ashok, we'll have Jens Tarnhardt, the head of Digital Innovation Asia, who will give a perspective on the social media landscape seen from China. Following this, Susan Pupula, who works with human value optimization, will talk about how social media is being used in Nigeria and give that African perspective on where we are right now and where it's taking us as we move forward. And finally, my own colleague Daniel Ort Rasmussen, a senior analyst at Seismonaut, will share a few insights on the topic as it develops, seen from the Danish scene as such. We'll give our 3 international speakers a chance to present first, then we'll take a short break, then we'll gather all 4 of them, including Daniel, after the break for a panel discussion, and Daniel will then round up with his insights on what's happening on the Danish scene as we move forward.
I mean, and these platforms don't work too differently from your traditional dating platforms, except that there's a lot more focus on things like traditionally, people in India, if it's an arranged marriage, they marry people within the same socioeconomic class, they marry people who speak at least one common language. And nowadays, you know, a lot of other factors, like for example, somebody with a valid H-1B US visa and so on, these are all sort of factors that now get into this entire thing. And it's remarkable how the social platforms themselves have adopted in very, very unique ways to cater to this from the point of view of privacy. There's actually something for Facebook and the other social networks to learn from the kind of privacy settings these sites offer, because they're very, very particular about, here's the interesting thing, in many cases, the woman will typically not allow the other person to see the photo of herself till a certain level of trust has been achieved. You will sometimes realize that, oh, do these people ever have fun? All they seem to do is work and study. At least the ones who tend to migrate abroad. And that is increasingly true. Indian parents, much like parents in China, are extremely ambitious and quite controlling in terms of what their children's career choices should be on average. I mean, it's changing, you know, urban, upper middle class India, a lot more independent, you know, kids doing their own thing in the Western way, but still a lot of people, there's a very strong aspiration. You'd be surprised at the number of high school kids who are on LinkedIn. They have LinkedIn profiles that sound like, you know, somebody with, you know, a couple of MBA degrees when they're just still in high school.
When it comes to Asia, it's a little bit similar to Europe, you know, but maybe even more so in Asia. It's very important to have your own strategy when it comes to these countries. And this is going a little bit more in depth when we look at e-commerce engagement and social media engagement. So we see that actually China, when it comes to e-commerce engagement, meaning people buying online, and social media engagement being active online, China is actually very active on both angles, and that makes it the perfect market to use digital and social when you want to enter that market for whatever reason.
With this website, you can see you've got all the online facilities to be able to buy with a credit card, use a voucher, or what have you. But it's not just about the commercial side. Education and development still remain important. I was talking to a friend recently who was talking about setting up an online university so that people that wouldn't necessarily, outside, in addition to the middle class, that people that wouldn't normally have access to education would be able to do so. Then funny enough, I happened to be listening to CNN and I came across this young man who happens to have set up, it's still quite new, but he's setting up Nigeria's first private online university. If you remember, I mentioned when I was in university, it was very much reliant on handouts for educational material. Well, if you look, you can see amongst everything else, one of the things he's doing is talking about providing free learning resources from top universities. Now that will be available to people that are rich and people that are poor alike, as long as they have the resources to be able, the capability to be able to get online. So that's an example of what's happening at the educational.
You talked about that China has many platforms that are actually just a version of the ones that we have in the Western world. Do you know why it's preferred to use these domestic platforms?
I think it was an evolution where before the Chinese government was a little bit afraid of some of the control in terms of messaging that has been going on. In China, normally, if you have an internet site, if it's a business or if it's a company, an online venture, you need to be registered with the Chinese government and hosted in China. So obviously the Facebooks of the world are not, you know, Chinese companies and so on. So they were censored to gain control. And while they were censored, Chinese versions were developed. And these Chinese versions in many ways became more relevant to Chinese consumers. And then now basically you have almost like your own Chinese internet landscape and infrastructure that people are using.
Yeah. If you were to, as a government, open up for all these Western platforms, do you think it would change the way the Chinese people would use these platforms? Would they still use domestic more than like Facebook, for instance?
It's a great question. We get it all the time, because obviously, Western companies that want to enter the Chinese market would feel much more comfortable in using the Facebooks, the Twitters, and so on. But we believe that it wouldn't really change much. I think people are already on Sina Weibo, on Weixin, and all these platforms, and they're comfortable using that. And also, they're a lot more relevant than the Western platforms. Obviously they're also built for the Chinese market. From that standpoint, I don't think anything would change. Having said that, we do see an increase in users of Facebook in China. Even though it's censored, you can access it via VPN. But I think it's more in keeping in touch with people that in the Western world. So let's say a lot of people are traveling, Chinese people are traveling internationally, or they're working for international companies and they meet people and they want to keep in touch. And so that's one way of keeping in touch, because obviously Western people are not really on the Chinese platforms. So there's a divide. So Chinese people are many times on, let's say, Facebook and Twitter and so on, but it also is a lot slower. So they're not really then using it a lot in terms of how you and I would use it in terms of really engaging and reading articles and so on. It would be more like sending you a quick message and saying like, hey, how are you? But not in terms of using it as an engagement.
You talked about a vision actually to diminish the gap between the middle class and the more poor people. How do you see the internet's role and the social media platforms in doing this?
Well, the people in the middle class are very educated and they're much better able and more advanced in their use of technology as it stands. The people from poorer backgrounds don't necessarily have as much experience in that deeper thinking, but as they're going online, they're using these tools. It is developing their, should I say, critical thinking and their capability. They also see what other people are doing, both locally and internationally.